The winter of 1944 settled over the rear lines in Normandy like a slow, grinding pressure that never let men forget where they were. Fog clung to every surface, turning the workshops into pale silhouettes and the scattered tents into shapes that seemed to drift whenever the wind pushed through. The repair area felt half alive, humming with generators and rattling tools, yet always wrapped in the cold smell of burnt oil and wet steel. Even the Shermans, lined up with open hatches and exposed engines, looked tired, machines that had seen too much, waiting for hands to make them whole again. Ezra Malone moved among them without hurry or complaint. His boots sank into mud with each step, sucking at him like the war itself, but he barely noticed. He carried tools the way some men carried cigarettes. Habit, routine, a way to fill the space where words used to be. Few remembered the last time he'd spoken more than 2 sentences in a row, and Ezra preferred it that way. Silence gave him room to think, and thinking kept the memories of his brother, Nathan, from tearing open the old wound. Nathan had been loud, bright, reckless, the kind of man who made others stand straighter. Ezra, in contrast, had always worked in the background, repairing tractors, mending fences, fixing what others broke. After Kasserine, after the letter, his quiet nature had deepened into something solid and immovable. That morning, the fog hung low enough that Ezra could barely see the far edge of the lot. He crouched beside a damaged Sherman, hands numb, trying to coax a stubborn bolt free. The metal resisted, then gave suddenly with a sharp crack that echoed under the vehicle. Ezra exhaled, wiped grease on his sleeve, and stood just in time to hear the sound of engines, weak, uneven, limping back toward the camp. A returning platoon. Men gathered as the vehicles emerged from the mist, what remained of them. One Sherman crawled forward without a turret, its hull scarred and blackened where the gun assembly had been torn away. Another rolled on a crooked track, barely holding together. The tank crew sat on the armor like ghosts, eyes empty, faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. Ezra watched them pass, their silence louder than any explosion. Someone muttered a single word, tiger, and the rest didn't need explanation. Everyone knew what a tiger could do. Everyone had seen what it left behind. Something inside Ezra tightened, a feeling he hadn't allowed in years. Not anger exactly, more like a pressure he couldn't name. A tension born from helplessness and the memory of another battlefield where he had not been present, where Nathan had died trapped under armor Ezra would never repair. He went back to work, though his thoughts drifted. He gathered discarded parts near the scrap pile, sorting them by instinct. Metal rings, broken periscope tubes, lengths of wire that might still be useful. His hands moved without needing instruction, but his mind lingered on the shattered platoon, on the hollow faces of men who had survived only by chance. That muted desperation stayed with him long after survivors were led away for medical checks. The quiet broke an hour later when the bombardment started. The first shell landed somewhere beyond the tree line, shaking the ground and showering the workshop with dust. More impacts followed in a regular rhythm, distant but close enough to cut the camp off from the front-line supply route. Ezra dropped to one knee out of habit, bracing for the next blast. Then an officer approached, waving him over, shouting above the detonations. A Sherman had limped in with a ruined aiming system. The gunner couldn't target anything. Spare parts wouldn't arrive for days, if they arrived at all. Ezra stared at the disabled optics, the fractured lenses and twisted brackets. Something in him shifted. Very slowly, almost cautiously, he reached for the small pouch he kept hidden under his workbench, a pouch holding the crude optical device he had built from scrap, a project no one had taken seriously. The officer frowned. "What's that?" Ezra didn't answer. He simply opened the pouch and held up the gadget, fingers steady despite the thunder of distant artillery. A ring of metal, a tensioned wire, a repurposed periscope tube, a small idea, born in silence, waiting for a moment like this. The officer's skepticism hung in the cold air, but Ezra barely noticed. He was already kneeling beside the Sherman, clearing mud from the damaged mounting bracket with careful, deliberate motions. The bombardment thudded irregularly in the distance, shaking loose dust from the workshop beams. Yet his hands moved with the calm steadiness of someone who had spent a lifetime repairing things others had given up on. The tank crew gathered around him, shivering, anxious, eyes darting toward the tree-line, as if expecting the next shell to land directly on them. Ezra slipped the periscope tube into place, angling it so the internal mirror caught the weak winter light. The device looked pitiful, improvised, nothing like official Allied equipment. But inside Ezra, there was a quiet certainty, an understanding built from years of working the land. How to judge angles from a hillside, how to track the movement of a deer across tall grass, how vibrations traveled through metal fences and barn walls. Those instincts lived inside the Gadget he held, though he had never explained that to anyone. The gunner, a young man with trembling fingers, leaned closer. "And you're sure this thing works?" Ezra met his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Something in his expression, steady, unblinking, made the gunner swallow and nod. He mounted the device, tightening each improvised screw, adjusting every wire until the tension felt right. He had done this process dozens of times in secret, testing it on training grounds when no one was watching, tweaking it in quiet corners after long shifts. But this was the first time the device touched a real Sherman, the first time it might influence a real battle. The officer shook his head with a disbelieving scoff. "If this thing falls apart, it's on your head, Malone." Ezra didn't react. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his jacket, and signaled for the gunner to test it. The man climbed into position, looked through the makeshift sight, and froze. His breath hitched. Then a slow, almost fearful grin formed. "I can see through the smoke," he whispered. "It compensates automatically? How?" Ezra looked down at the mud, explaining the logic, how micro-vibrations stabilize a view, how the tension wire acted like a reference line, would only confuse them. Instead, he listened as the tank commander, previously unimpressed, climbed up to verify for himself. The commander muttered under his breath, adjusting controls, tilting the barrel. After a long moment, he leaned out and stared at Ezra with a mixture of disbelief and something like respect. Before he could speak, another shell detonated farther off, and the sky rumbled. The attack intensified, rumbling across the valley like rolling thunder. Soldiers shouted orders. Boots pounded through mud. Trucks roared to life. The workshop, isolated by the bombardment, felt like the last exposed rib of the entire flank. "Get this Sherman ready to move," the commander barked. "If we're hit here, we're dead." As the crew scrambled into action, the commander pulled Ezra aside. "I don't know what you built, Malone, but it might give us a chance." His voice dropped, almost grudging. "Stay close. We may need you again." Ezra gave a small nod. The words didn't warm him, but they settled something inside him. A quiet validation that he hadn't expected, hadn't even wanted. Still, it felt like the first time in months that his work meant more than keeping engines running. The Sherman rumbled out of the workshop, tracks grinding over broken earth. Ezra followed it with his eyes until the fog swallowed its shape. Then the workshop felt suddenly empty, too large, too silent except for the distant thunder of artillery. He walked back to his bench, sat heavily, and rested the empty pouch beside him. For the first time since the device's creation, he no longer had it. A strange feeling, loss, pride, anxiety, tightened in his chest. But before he could settle with that thought, another officer burst through the entrance. "Malone, another tank just rolled in. Same problem with the optics. And command says they're not sending replacements until the shelling stops." He paused, eyeing Ezra more carefully this time. "They said you might have something." Ezra rose slowly. His hands were cold, but his resolve felt warm and steady. He picked up a second set of scrap pieces, ones he had quietly prepared over weeks without admitting to himself what he was doing. Another prototype, slightly different, slightly better. The bombardment shook the ground again. Outside, the fog shifted like a living thing. Ezra stepped forward. There was work to do. The fog thickened through the afternoon, drifting between tents and vehicles like a pale curtain that hid more than it revealed. Ezra worked through it with steady determination, installing the second prototype onto another Sherman, whose crew watched him with a mix of nerves and hope. This crew was older, their faces marked by days without sleep, their uniforms stiff with dried mud. They had already lost 2 tanks this week. The commander, a grizzled sergeant with bandage around his left arm, looked at Ezra not with doubt, but with the exhausted openness of a man willing to accept any small chance of survival. Ezra mounted the device, adjusting the wire tension with tiny movements of his fingers. The sergeant crouched beside him, observing silently. After a long moment, he spoke in a low voice, just above the growl of distant artillery. "Heard what you did for Lieutenant Donner's crew this morning." He paused, studying Ezra's profile. "Men are talking. They think you might have given them something real." Ezra didn't look up. Compliments made him uneasy, especially one spoken in that tone, like he had stepped into a role bigger than himself. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a strategist. He was just a mechanic who hated seeing tanks return broken and men return worse. Once the device was secure, the sergeant climbed up, peered to the site, and let out a soft exhale. "Hell," he murmured. "It's faster than the original system." He looked at Ezra again, this time with gratitude. "We'll make this count." Ezra nodded slightly and stepped back as the tank roared to life. Its engine rumbled, shaking the frozen mud beneath them. The crew climbed aboard, their faces hard but centered. They moved with purpose. Something renewed in their posture, as if having one more tool, one more chance, made the weight on their backs just a little lighter. When the tank rolled away, Ezra felt the cold settle deeper into his bones. 2 tanks carried his work now. 2 crews would rely on ideas he had shaped in isolation, in the quiet moments when grief pressed too heavily to ignore. He didn't know yet whether that thought terrified him or anchored him. He returned to workshop, where the dusk light seeped through torn canvas like thin threads of orange. The bombardment had paused, the silence almost unsettling after hours of constant noise. Soldiers moved to the camp quickly, preparing fortifications, stacking sandbags, carrying ammunition. Something was shifting on the front. Ezra could feel it in the distant tremors of the ground, in the way officers spoke with clipped urgency. Rumors moved through the fog like sparks. Tigers advancing, flanking attempts, breakthroughs in the tree line. Inside the workshop, Ezra leaned on his bench and let himself breathe. The smell of oil and metal wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. He wiped his hands, looked at the scattered tools, and realized what the quiet meant. The calm before the next wave. His thoughts drifted unexpectedly to Nathan. He remembered standing in their father's barn after a storm, the roof half torn off, rain pouring inside. Nathan had insisted on fixing it immediately, even though the wind howled and the ladder shook under them. Ezra had wanted to wait to be cautious, but Nathan had smiled and said, "Sometimes you patch the roof while the sky's still falling." Ezra hadn't understood the meaning then. He did now. The memory pulled something tight inside him. Loss, yes, but also quiet resolve. A sharp whistle broke the silence. A messenger ran into the workshop, breathless, cheeks red from the cold. "Malone, front command wants all support crews ready. Tigers sighted near the east route. All tanks with functioning guns are being moved forward." Ezra stood straight. The messenger hesitated a moment, lowering his voice. "Your Gadget, the officers are arguing about it. Some want it banned until it's properly evaluated. But the tank commanders, they're begging to use it." He didn't wait for Ezra's reaction. Orders needed delivering. Boots splashed away through the mud. Ezra stood still for a long moment, feeling the pressure settle around him. He glanced at the few remaining pieces on his bench, the beginnings of a 3rd prototype. He hadn't expected to need another one so soon, but the decision made itself in seconds. He gathered the metal rings, wires, and tube, sliding them into the pouch with practiced efficiency. Outside, engines roared to life. The air vibrated with urgency. Ezra stepped out into the cold evening, the fog swirling around him, and moved toward the tanks forming up near the ridge. There was no guarantee command would approve, no certainty his work would be welcome. But men were preparing for a fight. They knew they might not survive. And Ezra, quiet, unnoticed Ezra, had something that could help. He tightened the strap of the pouch against his chest and walked faster. There was no time left for doubt. Night settled over the ridge with a weight that felt almost physical, as if the darkness itself pressed down on the men gathering near the tree line. The fog thinned but did not leave. Instead, it rolled low across the ground, carrying the smell of cold earth and engine exhaust. Shermans lined up in uneven rows, their silhouettes half hidden in the gloom. Crews moving around them with tense, clipped movements. The air buzzed with urgency, the kind that made every sound sharper and every breath feel shorter. Ezra walked through the staging area unnoticed at first, blending into the flow of mechanics, loaders, and runners. But the tank commanders recognized him quickly. One by one, eyes followed him, some curious, some hopeful, a few suspicious. His reputation, still little more than a rumor, had already spread faster than he expected. Men stepped aside, giving him space without being asked. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, but he didn't slow down. 3 Shermans had been assigned to hold the east route, a narrow depression between 2 wooded ridges where visibility was poor even in daylight. Ezra approached the first of them. Its crew gathered in a tight circle as they listened to a lieutenant reviewing the defensive plan. When the lieutenant noticed Ezra, his jaw tightened. "Malone," he said flatly, "we're under strict order not to use unauthorized modifications. Command believes we need standardization, not improvisation." The crew exchanged anxious looks. The gunner's hand trembled slightly on the edge of the hull. Ezra didn't argue. He simply opened the pouch and held up the 3rd prototype, his most stable version yet. Crafted with smoother rings and a precisely balanced wire assembly, the lieutenant's expression hardened. "We can't risk a malfunction in the middle of—" A voice cut him off from above the tank. The commander leaned out of the hatch, eyes sharp despite the shadows. "Lieutenant, with respect, our standard sights can't track a tiger through this fog. If Malone has something that works, I want it." "That's not your call," the lieutenant snapped. Ezra stayed silent, the device resting in his hands like a fragile truth neither of them wanted to fully confront. Another explosion echoed from the far tree line, distant but unmistakable. Men stiffened. Someone muttered that the tigers were testing the range. The lieutenant swallowed, torn between orders and the rising fear in his men's eyes. The commander broke the standoff with a quiet, firm sentence. "If we're dead before dawn, no one will care which manual we followed." After a long, brittle moment, the lieutenant looked away. "You have 10 minutes, Malone." Ezra nodded once, climbed onto the hull, and began the installation. Each movement felt heavier than usual, not because of the weight of the parts, but because of what the moment meant. The crew watched him with rapt attention as he adjusted the wire tension, aligned the tube, and secured the metal ring to the stabilizing bracket. The commander checked over his shoulder, murmured a quick good, and dropped back into the turret. When the installation was complete, Ezra stepped aside. The gunner slid into position, pressed his eye against the sight, and exhaled a shaky breath. "It holds steady," he whispered. "Even with the tank idling, it holds." The lieutenant didn't speak. He only stared at Ezra, expression unreadable. Across the staging area, the 2nd and 3rd Shermans waited in silence. Their commanders had witnessed everything. When Ezra approached them, they didn't hesitate. They simply pointed at the mounting brackets and said, almost in unison, "Do it." Working quickly, he installed the devices on both tanks. The crews whispered among themselves, checking angles, testing the sight picture, marveling quietly at how it compensated for the uneven ground. The confidence that spread among them wasn't loud or boastful. It was a steady, controlled kind that soldiers clung to when facing impossible odds. By the time Ezra stepped back from the 3rd Sherman, the night had grown colder. The air vibrated with faint metallic groans as tanks locked their turrets forward. Officers moved through the lines, handing out final instructions. The fog glowed faintly as someone lit a cigarette, then quickly crushed it underfoot to keep the darkness intact. Ezra felt something shift deep inside him, a mixture of anticipation, dread, and a strange calm. He wasn't a fighter, but his work was walking into battle. His hands, his ideas, his quiet calculations, they were about to be tested against steel giants that had torn through Allied lines like predators through a flock. A soldier approached him, tapping Ezra lightly on the arm. "Sir, Malone, they want you at the command tent." Ezra blinked, surprised. Mechanics were rarely summoned anywhere near command structures. He followed the soldier through the fog, boots sinking into the wet earth, the night filled with the restrained energy of men preparing to meet death head-on. Something waited for him beyond those canvas walls, approval or punishment or something in between. But Ezra kept walking. He had done what needed doing. The command tent glowed faintly from within, its canvas walls pulsing with the shadows of officers moving briskly around a long table. Ezra hesitated at the entrance, half expecting someone to turn him away. Mechanics didn't belong here. This was where maps lived, where decisions were made, where men with authority spoke in clipped tones about lives they would never meet. But the guard at the flap lifted it, without question, and Ezra stepped inside. The air was thick with tension. A lantern hung from the center pole, casting a pale circle of light over a map covered in markers, red lines pushing hard against thin blue defenses. Several officers clustered around it, their voices low, urgent. Colonel Whitford, tall and rigid, dominated the group. He was the kind of man whose posture seemed permanently locked at attention, his jaw clenched as though even speaking felt like an inconvenience. When he turned and saw Ezra, his expression tightened. "Malone," he said, the name almost a reprimand. "I hear you've been modifying equipment without authorization." Ezra stood still, hands clasped behind his back, the pouch hanging at his side. He didn't bother defending himself. He knew the accusation was technically true. But behind the colonel, another officer, Major Kellen, spoke before Whitford could continue. "We've also heard reports from field commanders," Kellen said, softer in tone but no less intense. "3 crews insist your devices improve their sight picture under fog conditions. And if the Tigers push through the east route, we lose the supply corridor entirely." Whitford shot the major a warning look, but Kellen pressed forward. "Sir, we need every advantage." The colonel exhaled sharply, pacing once around the table as if searching for patience in the lantern glow. "We do not rely on untested inventions built out of scrap metal," he said. "This is the United States Army, not a barn workshop." Ezra felt no shame at the phrasing, barn workshop. He was a bar mechanic once, and the war had not changed that core truth. If anything, it had sharpened it. A distant boom rolled across the valley, rattling the tent poles. Every officer froze for a fraction of a second. Another impact followed, closer this time. Someone rushed in from outside. "Colonel!" Enemy armor movement confirmed at the east ridge. Multiple heavy silhouettes. The tent erupted into motion. Paper rustled, markers shifted, officers barked orders. Whitford straightened, his face hardening with command authority. "All units to battle positions. Get those Shermans moving." Kellen leaned toward him, voice steady but urgent. "Sir, Malone's devices are already installed. If they work, even partially, they may give the gunners time to land the first shot. With Tigers, that's life or death." Whitford hesitated only a heartbeat, but Ezra saw it, the crack in certainty, the knowledge that standard procedures might not hold the line tonight. He turned to Ezra. "You think your device is reliable?" he asked, voice low, searching. Ezra met his gaze without flinching. "It holds steady," he said simply. 3 words. Enough. Another explosion shook the night, closer still. Whitford's jaw clenched. "Very well," he snapped. "It stays. But Malone, if any tank malfunctions because of your contraption, the responsibility is yours." Ezra nodded once, accepting without fear. The colonel pointed to the exit. "Then get out there. You're staying with the forward crews. If this thing breaks, I want you close enough to fix it." Ezra turned and left the tent, stepping back into the cold night. The air felt sharper now, vibrating with the deep, rumbling growl of engines warming up. The 3 modified Shermans were forming into a staggered line, their silhouettes moving like restless animals preparing for a brutal contest. As Ezra approached, the crewmen greeted him with subtle nods, not cheers, not gestures of celebration, but acknowledgments filled with quiet, desperate trust. They didn't know him well. They didn't need to. They believed in the device because it gave them something solid to hold in the face of a metal predator. A loader jogged past him, breath steaming in the cold. "Tigers are coming through the trees," he whispered, voice shaking. "Big ones. Heard their engines myself." Ezra felt a pulse of old fear in his chest, not for himself, but for the men already climbing into their tanks, sealing themselves inside steel coffins that might keep them alive or fail them entirely. He ran a hand over the cold armor of the nearest Sherman, feeling the vibrations of the engine beneath it. This was Nathan's world, the world of crews, of trust between turret and tread. Ezra had never fought inside one of these machines, never tasted the cramped heat or the screaming metal of a hit, but he had touched their bones. He knew what they endured. Headlights snapped off. Command wanted darkness. Engines rumbled. The fog shifted, illuminated faintly by the distant fires of the front. The Tigers were coming. And Ezra, for the first time in his life, stood in the open at the edge of a battlefield, his work about to meet the enemy before he ever did. The forest ahead breathed with a low mechanical growl. Too steady, too heavy to be anything but German armor. The sound carried the fog like a warning rumble from something ancient and hungry. Men froze, listening. Even the Sherman seemed to brace themselves, engines idling in tense anticipation. Ezra stood between the first and second tank, his breath forming small clouds that drifted into the night. He couldn't see the Tigers yet, but he felt them like pressure in the air before a storm breaks. The modified Shermans crept forward into the shallow depression of the east route, their tracks sinking into wet earth. The ground dipped just enough to limit visibility, turning the fog into a shifting curtain. Ezra stayed close to the lead tank until the commander leaned from a hatch and shouted down to him, "Malone, this is where you stop. Too dangerous past this point." Ezra nodded, though part of him wanted to stay closer. But he stepped aside, boots sliding slightly on the slick mud. He watched as the tanks rolled ahead in staggered formation, each one adjusting its turret slowly, deliberately, guided now by the small metal rings, wires, and tubes he had pieced together with quiet hands. The forest went silent. Then, in a single violent moment, it erupted. A German 88 fired from somewhere deep in the trees. The flash was a white spear in the darkness, followed by a crack that split the air and a roar that made the earth tremble. The first shell slammed into the ridge behind the Shermans, sending mud and broken roots flying. Men dove for cover. Ezra shielded his head, the shockwave thudding through his chest. Contact. Tigers front. The shout echoed like a spark across dry brush. Turrets turned. Engines roared. The three Shermans moved with quick coordination, spreading out to deny the Tigers a clean line of fire. Ezra watched from behind a mound of dirt, heart hammering, vision locked on the glowing muzzle flashes flickering through the trees. Another 88 thundered. This time it hit closer, too close, and the ground shuddered under Ezra's hands. The lead Sherman jerked as shrapnel grazed his left side, but the armor held. The commander inside shouted for the gunner to adjust elevation. And this was a moment. Ezra knew it even before the shot was fired. The gunner used the improvised sight, a quick correction, a micro-shift in angle, a steadying line against the trembling hull. The Sherman's cannon flashed, loud and bright, the recoil throwing a wave of heat into fog. Ezra tracked the shell's arc with tense anticipation. A heartbeat later, a deep metallic thud echoed through the forest. A tiger groaned, not destroyed, but hit. Cheers didn't break out. There was no time. Another German shot roared past, carving a trench of steam through the fog. The Tigers were advancing now, their silhouettes emerging slowly like enormous predators stepping out of trees. Ezra's breath caught. He had never seen one this close. The machine was massive, slabs of steel, sharp angles, a cannon that seemed impossibly long. And there were more behind it. 2, maybe 3. The Shermans moved again, shifting position in a tight, almost choreographed arc. Ezra could see the strain on the crews, even from a distance. Turrets swinging faster, commanders shouting through hatch openings, loaders scrambling to keep up. But something was different tonight. They weren't scrambling blindly. The gunners were adjusting faster, much faster. One of the Shermans fired again. Another corrected within seconds. The devices gave them a rhythm, a way to hold steady on uneven terrain. Ezra could see it in the precision of their aim, the confidence in how they repositioned after each recoil. Then came the moment that made his chest tighten. The second Sherman scored a direct hit, a flash of sparks, a deep internal boom inside the Tiger's hull. The German engine sputtered, then roared again, tried to recover. But the shot had found a weak point. Smoke poured from the rear grating. Hit! It's burning. Ezra felt something like disbelief, pride, fear, and vindication collide inside him. His hands shook. Not from cold this time, but from a realization that the crews were surviving because of something he'd built. But the Tigers weren't finished. The third one advanced with brutal speed, its turret swinging toward the lead Sherman. The commander inside shouted, "Move! Move!" Ezra rose instinctively, as if he could push the tank himself. The Sherman lurched forward, mud spraying from its tracks. The German cannon fired. A flash, a scream of metal. The Sherman took the hit on its side armor. The blast rocked it violently, and for a moment Ezra thought it had been breached. But the tank held. Black scars smoked along its flank. But the crew inside kept moving, kept fighting. The gunner aligned the improvised sight again. Ezra whispered under his breath. Not a prayer, not a plea, but something like a hope he had never allowed himself before. The Sherman fired. The Tiger shuddered. Its turret stalled mid-rotation. Smoke poured out thick and dark from the engine compartment. Not a kill, but a crippling blow. The Shermans closed the angle. Another shot, another impact, and finally, an explosion that lit the fog in a violent burst of orange. The Tiger burned. Ezra stared, breath caught in his throat, as the surviving Tigers began to pull back into the trees, their engines groaning with frustration. The Shermans kept advancing cautiously, lights off, guns trained on the retreating silhouettes. They had held the route. 3 Shermans, 3 improvised devices, 3 crews alive. Ezra exhaled slowly, his pulse still racing. The battle wasn't over. But something had shifted. Tonight, the predators had been hunted back. Smoke drifted low across the valley like wounded breath, clinging to the ground where the Tigers had fallen back. The night stayed restless. Distant artillery still thudding along other sections of the front. But in the shallow depression of the east route, a tense, fragile quiet settled. The Shermans idled in a loose semicircle, engines cooling in sharp metallic clicks. Their crews remained inside for several long seconds after the firing stopped, as if afraid the silence itself might be a trap. Ezra stepped carefully over churned mud and broken branches, moving toward the nearest tank. His knees felt stiff. His hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline of the clash. He had not fired a weapon, had not taken cover behind armor, yet the battle had wrapped itself around him in a way he'd never imagined. When he reached the Sherman's flank, the commander popped the hatch open and leaned out. "Malone!" he shouted down, breathing hard. "That sight, whatever you did, it saved us." Ezra looked up at him, but the word stuck somewhere in his chest. The commander didn't wait for a reply. He simply reached down, gripped Ezra's shoulder, and squeezed hard before turning back inside to check on his crew. The gesture, small and rough, left Ezra feeling strangely unsteady. The second tank crew emerged soon after, the gunner sliding down the side armor with a long exhale. He walked straight to Ezra, helmet tucked under his arm. "Never seen a Tiger back off like that," he said, shaking his head. "Your Gadget gave us the edge. Thought you should know." Ezra nodded, but his mind kept returning to the flashes of fire in the forest, the thunder of 88 shells, the sight of a Tiger burning through the fog. He had watched battles from a distance before, heard them, felt the ground shake beneath them. But tonight, he had been close enough to smell the heated metal, close enough to see terror flicker in men's eyes and resolve settle over them like armor. A shout drew his attention. The third Sherman, the one that had taken the side hit, was shutting down its engine. The crew climbed out cautiously, checking damage under the dim glow of a handheld lamp. The loader knelt beside a deep scar in the armor, whistling low. If that shell had hit an inch higher, he didn't finish the sentence. Ezra approached, crouching beside the damaged plate. The steel was warped but intact. The Tiger round hadn't penetrated. Luck, or fate, or maybe just the stubborn resilience of Allied armor. But the sighting device, that had not been luck. The commander of the damaged Sherman walked over, helmet under his arm, face pale from shock. He looked at Ezra quietly for several seconds before speaking. "You gave us enough time to angle," he said. "If we'd aimed slower, we'd be dead. That thing you built, it saved the tank." His voice tightened. It saved my men. Ezra lowered his gaze, unsure how to carry the weight of those words. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt responsible for the tanks that had hit their marks, for the tigers burning in the trees, for the lives that had been spared, and for the ones that might not be next time. Before Ezra could reply, a jeep rolled up the hillside, headlights off. Colonel Whitford stepped out, followed by Major Kellen and 2 aides. The officers walked with urgency, boots sinking into the churned soil. The crew straightened instinctively, though not quite to full attention. They were still shaking, still processing. Whitford surveyed the scene. The burning tiger in the distance cast faint orange flickers through the fog, its engine crackling like a dying furnace. The colonel's stern face softened just enough for the men to notice. "Reports say the enemy armor is retreating up the slope," Kellen announced. "You held the route." No cheers, just exhausted nods. The men knew what the victory meant, and how narrow the margin had been. Whitford stepped closer to Ezra. The colonel's gaze dropped to the nearest improvised sight, still clamped to the Sherman's turret. He examined it without touching, jaw tight, expression unreadable. Finally he looked up. "Your device functioned," he said quietly. "Better than expected." Ezra waited. The compliment didn't feel like one. It felt like a statement being weighed, measured. "Don't misunderstand," Whitford continued, voice firm again. "This does not mean I approve of unauthorized modifications. But," he paused, the word hanging in the cold air, "tonight it saved lives." For a moment, even just a moment, the colonel's eyes met Ezra's with something almost like respect. "We'll reassess regulations in the morning," he added stiffly. Kellen stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Malone, the crews want to keep the sights mounted for now. And frankly, I agree." He glanced toward the forest, where the last tiger still burned in a dull orange glow. "The enemy won't stay quiet for long." Ezra breathed in slowly, feeling the cold sting his lungs. The officers moved off to speak with the tank commanders, leaving him standing in the churned mud amid 3 exhausted crews who now looked at him not as a background mechanic, but as someone whose hands had shaped their survival. He didn't know what to do with that. One of the gunners nudged him gently. "Hey, you should get your hands checked. You're shaking." Ezra looked at his fingers, grease-stained, scraped, trembling. But it wasn't fear. It was release. He had carried tension for hours without noticing. Now that the valley had gone quiet, the weight finally lifted, leaving the tremors behind as proof. He stepped back, letting the crews regroup, letting the night settle around him. The fog drifted again over the valley, moving like a slow tide. The smell of smoke and metal mixed with the cold air. Ezra turned toward the workshop far, behind the ridge. Home, of a sort. A place of tools and silence where he understood every part, every bolt, every motion. But something in him knew he couldn't go back the same. Tonight had changed things. Not just for the tanks. For him, dawn crept in slowly, pushing pale light across the valley where the fog still clung stubbornly to the earth. The remains of the night's battle lay scattered in silence. Scorched soil, torn branches, and the distant, burned-out husk of the tiger that had tried to force its way through the east route. The Sherman sat in a loose line along the ridge, steam rising from their armor in the cold morning air. Men moved quietly among them, speaking in low voices, checking tracks, inspecting damage, absorbing the uneasy calm that came only after surviving the impossible. Ezra walked alone toward the workshop. The ground squelched beneath his boots, little pockets of mud clinging to them with each step. His limbs felt heavy and exhaustion tugged at him like an invisible hand, but his mind stayed alert, replaying the night in a slow loop. Muzzle flashes in the fog, the thunder of the 88s, the sight of a tiger shuddering under a well-placed shot. He had stood close enough to feel the heat passing from tank to earth, close enough to understand what it meant for men to trust their lives to a mechanic's idea built from scrap. As he passed by supply tents and half-wrecked vehicles, soldiers nodded at him, small, respectful gestures that caught him off guard every time. Word had spread faster than he could walk. Crews whispered stories as he passed. That's him. The sight that let them track through the fog. The mechanic who made tigers back off. He had never been the center of anything before. The attention made him uneasy, but there was no hostility in it, only gratitude, edged with disbelief. When he reached the workshop, the familiar scent of oil and metal wrapped around him like an old coat. Tools lay exactly where he had left them. The bench held the scraps from his third device. Tiny rings, spent wires, bits of metal shaved smooth by hours of careful work. He slid onto his stool, rested his elbows on the table, and let the silence settle over him. The night still vibrated through his bones, but here, in this small space, he could finally breathe. He picked up the leftover periscope tube, the old, battered one he had modified dozens of times, and turned it slowly in his hands. Every scratch told a story. Ideas tried and abandoned, adjustments made in the late hours of long nights, experiments driven not by orders but by intuition and a kind of stubborn hope. Nathan had once teased him for spending hours tinkering with broken tools. "You fix things that don't even need fixing," he'd said, laughing. Ezra understood now. It wasn't about fixing. It was about making something better than what the world handed you. Behind him, footsteps approached. Major Kellen ducked under the workshop frame, his uniform still smeared from the night's fighting. "Malone," he greeted softly. Ezra set the tube down. "They're keeping the devices on the Shermans," Kellen said, closing the distance. Colonel Whitford spoke with division command. "They want to run formal tests when things calm down, but after last night, no one's removing anything. They consider it mission critical." He gave a faint smile. "That's the closest to praise you'll ever get from Whitford." Ezra nodded, accepting the information without emotion. Kellen studied him for a moment longer. "You did something important," the major added quietly. "Not many people can say that." Ezra didn't respond. He wasn't sure how. Kellen didn't push. He clapped Ezra lightly on the shoulder and stepped back toward the exit. "Get some rest. There'll be more fighting soon." When the major left, Ezra remained still for a long time. The workshop hummed with distant generators, the rhythm steady and comforting. He looked down at his hands, still stained with grease and dirt, still trembling faintly. Not from fear now, but from the weight of survival. Men were alive because of something he had built. Men he barely knew. Men who had climbed into steel coffins and come back out again. He rose slowly and walked to the entrance, leaning on the doorframe as he looked out across the camp. The early morning light revealed the Shermans rolling toward the maintenance line, their crews guiding them carefully. The modified sights clung to their turrets, catching faint glints of dawn. Rumors were already spreading. Stories of accuracy under fog, of resilience under fire, of 3 Shermans holding back a formation of tigers. Stories that would grow and twist in the telling, but all rooted in one simple truth. Ingenuity had made a difference. A loader passing by spotted Ezra and gave him a quick salute. Informal, warm. "Thank, Malone," he said. "Didn't think we'd see daylight." Ezra nodded back. 2 moved to form words. The loader rejoined his crew. Others walked past with subtle nods. Pats on his arm, murmured acknowledgments. Not loud, not showy, just quiet recognition. From men who understood how close the night had come going the other way. Ezra stepped back inside, returning to his bench. He adjusted the lamp, its faint orange glow spilling across the table. Carefully, he picked up the old periscope tube again, running a thumb along its cool metal. He set it in place under the light, as if it were the first piece of a new puzzle. He wasn't sure what came next. He wasn't sure command would ever formally approve his work, or the device would spread to other units, or fade into obscurity like so many wartime solutions. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would keep building, not for recognition, not for praise. For the same reason he'd always fixed broken tractors, mended fences, repaired engines, because someone needed help, and because he could. Outside, the early sun broke through the fog, sending warm light across the cold metal of the Shermans. Crews gathered around them, preparing for whatever came next. In the quiet of the workshop, Ezra lowered his head over the periscope tube. His hands moved slowly, gently, like a man tending a fire meant to keep others alive through the night. The war was far from over, but the legend of the ghost mechanic had begun, and somewhere beyond the ridge, in the drifting morning haze, the faint echo of that legend was already taking shape, passed from crew to crew, spoken softly by men who had survived the darkness. Ezra Malone worked on, unseen, steady and resolute, hands of grease, mind of quiet fire, and a gift that would outlast the smoke of the battlefield.